We have been studying the chapter titled The Moods of the Self, where Sri Aurobindo is now placing our experience of the world in context of the station where the self presides liberated, where the ego has been dissolved and the consciousness has been awakened into its cosmic identity. All this being the theme of the previous chapters. From such a poise, how does one engage with the world where we seek to know and express the highest in life? And this, he says, is not easy for the mental being, because the highest truths and the highest modes of existence are beyond the mind, supramental. And yet, if we are to act through the human personality, it will still be through this vehicle of the mind, of our life energies, of our body, that this action would have to be expressed. And so how does one reconcile these extremes? And in the portions we have read so far, Sri Aurobindo has covered many important perspectives, justifying various philosophical and religious traditions and their more perhaps extreme positions. And the paragraph we are now beginning, he reconciles them all into a larger picture, experience. We will begin to read this and then refer to the portions we have read before as necessary. What is important to recognize is, in all of our earlier study, where we saw the failings, limitations of various traditions, the object was not to criticize them or to claim a superior philosophy or practice or worldview. The object rather was to realize a perspective that is all-inclusive, because that is the way the divine manifests the world and experiences the world. For that purpose, we recognize how in history there have been specialized formulations of a divine experience, which were necessary at that time, which were perhaps even essential for a certain development in human evolution, for realizing and fixing in the extreme certain possibilities. Nature herself leading these various specializations, secretly the divine will, the divine wisdom guiding humanity through these specialized extremes. Each of them has served a purpose, and yet in the current stage of human development, they all were specializations, because humanity as a whole was not yet ready for a larger synthesis. And so when we studied earlier the illusionist Advaita or the Buddhistic nihilism or the qualified monism, each of these is a great school of philosophy, thought, practice. Each of these has served such an important purpose, and yet when we see their limitations or their contradictions when placed against each other, but also internal contradictions, it is not so much to criticize, but it is in to rise to a poise which is greater. And from this higher synthetic perspective, we are now able to experience more completely. So such has been the discussion so far. And Sri Aurobindo now summarizes the whole scene in a single sentence, and you will see how comprehensive the sentence is, although simply stated. We'll come to, it's the second sentence that we will come to. First he says, the sadhaka of an integral yoga will take an integral view of his goal and seek its integral realization. That sounds pretty simple. If we are in an integral yoga, the view of the goal must also be integral, and it must be realized integrally. This may sound very simple when stated like this, but it is this which distinguishes us from the integral approach. They specify for themselves an aspect of the divine as their goal, set themselves an approach and a realization. And in each of these, they accepted that particular aspect, path, or realization as not only sufficient, but also as complete. Therein lies their opposition. So obviously, if our yoga, the framework of the practice, will be integral, it must also see the goal integrally and aim at a realization, knowing that the way the divine knows itself, the way it knows itself completely in all its aspects. And now, what is that like? And here he gives in one sentence the full picture. The divine has many essential modes of his eternal self-manifestation, possesses and finds himself on many planes and through many poles of his being. Very simply stated, and you will see shortly how rich this is. And then he completes it. To each mode, its purpose, to each plane or pole, its fulfillment, both in the apex and the supreme scope of the eternal unity. Now, this is one sentence, but it justifies every viewpoint, every experience, every philosophy, every path that has ever been discovered, not merely created by fantasy, but discovered as a real experience. Each of these is now seen in its right place. But the sentence itself has many technical terms because he holds himself in a poise which captures all, and so the words used often seem somewhat abstract to someone who is not used to the vocabulary or the sense of what they indicate. So let's just look at this in some detail. The rest of the paragraph is actually an elaboration of this, and the subsequent paragraphs are a further elucidation of this big picture. And this is the integral perspective. The divine has many essential modes of his eternal self-manifestation. So when he manifests himself, the manifestation did not start at one point and end at one point, because then we would ask what was before and what is after. The divine himself being beyond time, expressing himself in a rhythmic movement of time, he is ever present in eternity. The manifestation itself exists in eternity, therefore. In that eternity, there are many modes of his self-expression. Out of the infinite modes of his self-expression, there are some which are essential, and those essential modes of his self-expression are themselves innumerable. There is, most obvious in the essential, is the mode of expressing himself in an individual. There is the mode of expressing himself universally, as a universe, as a whole. There are various in-between special modes of expressing as a collective. And there are collectives which are more essential in the human experience. The family unit, the tribal unit, the nation unit, the collective at a planetary level. Each of these are himself entirely. This was part of the discussion we had 2.5 pages ago, where Sri Aurobindo describes how each of these collective identities is in fact the divine entirely expressing himself as that. Now this is very different from the common philosophies in which these things are formulated. In some, taking these more extreme positions, the illusionist Advaita sees all of this play of forms and collective identities as part of an illusory play, of an illusory energy. The Buddhistic nihilism sees all this as a domain of ignorance and suffering, and having no essential divinity in these forms or in their play. The qualified monism, which views everything as waves of the one, still sees them as partial expressions of the one, because they are like waves, not the one itself. Sri Aurobindo gives a perspective which is the approach of the Vedic experience also, where every form is the entire expression of the divine in that particular form, aspect, or expression. The tree is the divine entirely putting himself in becoming tree. The leaf is also the divine entirely putting himself in becoming the leaf. And in the leaf, the particular molecule of sugar is entirely the divine placing himself as molecule of sugar. Now this poise is difficult for the limited physical rational mind, because with our physical mind we see leaf is part of the tree, the molecule of sugar is part of the leaf. So if the tree is wholly the divine, the leaf must be a part of the divine, isn't it? Just as the tree, being a part of the universe, must be part of the divine. But this is precisely the limitation of the way the mind has been taught to see in its early stage of evolution, where it sees things by cutting up and separating and then rejoining. So everything is seen as part of something else or containing other things. But the reality is that the leaf could not exist as leaf unless the full support of the divine was behind it, not only supporting but becoming leaf. that it chooses to express its becoming of leaf through its other becoming of tree is only a relationship that it has set with itself. In our mind, we can conceive of leaf as leaf, flower as flower, independent of the tree. And we can do that because it in fact exists as its own pure, real idea, independent of tree. It emerges out of tree because the divine chooses to set up that one particular relationship for the purpose of the play. But it could just as well have been brought into material existence by other means. And so, this perspective where we see each thing itself as the divine, not a part of the divine put out. It puts a small part as leaf and a larger part as tree and the whole of itself as universe. Not like that. It puts itself entirely because it is indivisible. It is always whole, always complete. And so everything and every form is itself completely. And what we see is the play of the relationships it sets itself in the entire container that we call the universe, which is also itself entirely. All at the same time. So this view, you can see, is quite different from these philosophical frameworks, which are all partially capturing parts of this view and highlighting that and saying this is it, this is all. So when Sri Aurobindo was asked what is his position, he said the closest to the traditional systems is the qualified monism, where you see everything as waves of the ocean. But that's not his view either. It's the closest in terms of similarity, as you can see here. But we are not merely waves which represent a part of the ocean. We are the entire ocean. This is the perspective of the Vedic rishis, and from loss of this perspective, the Vedas were understood therefore also in aspects and fragments. You will see in the Veda this rhythm because it is also equally a artistic, musical composition or expression of beauty and delight in the verses. In the Veda, ideas are expressed and the language is framed. And so it has a orchestra-like feel to it. Many multiple ideas simultaneously rising in waves and then another wave rising and so on. So there is a wave where, for example, the rishis now pick on a certain aspect of the divine, a certain form, and then exalt that as the highest, and through that see all the other deities and powers of the divine. And then they move to another and exalt that as the highest, and through that see all others. In so doing, they were merely highlighting this one truth, that through each of these manifestations of the divine, it is the whole divine which is seen working through this special front. The rest are all in it. Now if we had to put this in the example that we have earlier discussed, in the tree is the whole universe, is the mountain, is all possibilities including of leaves and flowers. Therefore the flower can sprout out, the leaf can sprout out of the tree. In the leaf, now as a separate expression of the divine, is the whole universe, including the mountain and the tree and the flower and everything else. And in the seed equally, everything is held. Therefore, out of seed, the entire tree can grow. But only certain of these relationships are actively used in the current rhythm of nature's play. Nature could be taught or helped to shift to other rhythms, that other forms could emerge out of these forms. In fact, this is what the scientists are doing through genetic manipulation. We're taking a particular species, you draw out of it possibilities which belong properly to other species. But they were all there inherent as a potential, therefore this is possible. And everything being inherent in everything else, potentially anything can be drawn out of anything. And it is this idea which was the basis of the skill of the ancients in developing various kinds of technologies. And they played with this especially to draw out the very opposite of quality from that which is obvious. Out of stone, to draw out the appearance and the sensation of something soft, silky, and flowing. You can make out of stone a big, crude, heavy block of a sculpture, and it might be good. But if out of that stone you draw out something which is light, supple, silky, smooth like velvet, not stone at all, that would be a marvel, isn't it? To draw out of something that which was not seen in it, that is the real skill, that is the real art, that is the real technique. And you see, this is what technology does in its best. You take sand and draw out of it intelligent behavior. We call it computer chip. But the same thing done in practically every substance. You take ash, burnt charcoal, carbon, and out of that you create something. Nowadays with carbon nanotubes, you are able to do extraordinary things. Make substance that is even harder than steel, but it is lighter and more flexible, and things like that. So the idea that within everything, the divine being essentially present, anything can be drawn out of anything. What nature has done across the eons is to develop certain rhythms of drawing out things from other things, dependencies out of each other. So when the tree roots extend into the earth, take the soil and out of it transform it into a flower. We are not surprised at the miracle because we have been seeing it since we were born, and we have got habituated to seeing it as something normal. But the reality is, the first time that it took place in the universe, you would have said, my God, what a miracle. How can it be possible that this hard stone has been turned into this beautiful flower? Who did it? By what magic? And that's the play of nature, creating this magic again and again in every activity of her play. And now we see this play from this deeper perspective. Okay, we drift a little bit, but all of this will be relevant in our big picture in the elaboration of it. What he's saying here is there are many essential modes of his eternal self-manifestation, and he dwells upon a particular mode, a particular way of expressing himself in form. One, and then the play of many. That's another mode. The play of the universal is another mode. The aspect of the individual, the aspect of personality, and the aspect of impersonality. All of these are various modes through which his eternal self-manifestation takes place. So the divine has many essential modes of his eternal self-manifestation, possesses and finds himself on many planes. Now, if this was not complex enough, all of these modes can exist on many planes of consciousness. And we typically describe them as a vertical ascension because it's convenient for the mind. The reality is all of these planes are coterminous. They are present simultaneously right here, right now. But in each of them, because each represents a change, a difference in consciousness, because the consciousness itself is different, the way the consciousness perceives is different. The way the consciousness experiences itself is different. And these two aspects of the consciousness are captured in these two words. Possesses and finds himself on many planes. You would wonder why he says possesses and finds. Possesses in the way he knows himself, finds himself, because when it looks at another to know another, it's still himself, but finding now through an external perception. So in each plane, because the very nature of the consciousness is so different, we're aware of ourselves differently, and we know and relate to others differently. And all of these are simultaneously here and now. Now, in a creature like the human being, where broadly the physical plane, vital plane, and mental plane have been embedded into each other, we are at the same time aware of and operating on these three levels of the cosmos. So we have a physical body substance. I am this body. And from this body awareness, I look out and enter in relation with other objects. This food I like, that food I don't like, for example. But already inside this, the other two levels are operating. So I like the food, I don't like the food, and the like and dislike is a different I. I am a person who enjoys this, does not enjoy that. I am a person of strong likes and dislikes, or mild tastes, or whatever it is. You have a whole personality now which has nothing to do with body, which is purely made of the impulses of your emotions and desires. And that is your second body. But it is simultaneously embedded in the physical body, although made of completely different substance. Its sense of identity is different, its relation with the world is different from the gross body's identity and its relation. And then upon that, fused into these two is the mind-body, where I am this person of thought. My idea of me is different from your idea of you. But it is on the basis of my idea of me that I relate to the world. And that is a completely different relationship and world of experience and identity. So if three layers actually, each having its own body substance and way of being and relating, squeeze into one lump, and all three are mixed. And this heavy mixture is what I call my personality. And of course, each of these different levels is mixing with the others to form finer levels, finer gradations. There's a part of my physical consciousness that turns to the energy, emotion, desire. There's a part of the emotion, energy, desire which turns to the physical embedding, and there's some point where they meet. But in the first turn, already a different grade of distinction of consciousness and way of being and experiencing, and in the other, finer distinction. Technically, in the terminology Sri Aurobindo uses, we would call this vital physical, that is the physical turning to the vital, and physical vital, which is the vital turning to the physical. Using a term here, layers which we are not entirely conscious of. We are much more conscious in the layer of the mind, so it's more useful to take an example there. Mind turning to the physical would be the physical mind. Mostly that's where we tend to live from childhood, because our mind woke up out of the body substance. So it's so deeply embedded in the values of the body and the body senses that it thinks itself one with the body, although its entire operation is free of has nothing to do with the body consciousness. This is the physical mind. Mind turned to and deeply under influence of the physical, but still it is mind. But because it is under influence of the physical and looks through the physical senses, this thing which I see is my only reality. If suddenly one day there's a knock on my head and briefly there is an awakening of clairvoyant sight and I begin to see realities of the vital or mental worlds, I will declare all those as physical realities, because I see them in the same way as I see the physical reality, and I cannot distinguish that this belongs to a different domain. If I declare them as physical realities and begin to behave by them, then I would be considered insane. If I am able to recognize that these belong to a different level, then I am called a clairvoyant. But They're still different layers of reality and have to learn to be able to distinguish between them. The other side is the mental physical. This is physical substance turning towards mind. It's the part of the body consciousness which is trying to become or has become somehow influenced by the mind and is almost as if self-aware. You will feel this, for example, in certain parts of the biology which are very sensitive and which are very developed. When, for example, in the fingers, there is a skill which is developed in playing an instrument. The fingers can as if do their own thing without your conscious intervention or leading. In the beginning, you have to infuse the mind in it by training. But once the part of the mental consciousness is sufficiently infused, the fingers not only have developed a skill which you taught it, now they have developed their own mental logic, so to say. And if now something has to be done, a particular pattern of notes that I have never done before, which involves a level of complexity I have never practiced, the finger can actually do it on its own just by my intending it. You're playing a very complex piece and you find this finger cannot reach that note and the hand just moves in a particular way to turn the finger and just reach the note. I've never practiced that. I've never consciously done it. The fingers did it. It's as if the intelligence which is proper to self-aware mind has been partially embedded in the physical consciousness. And this is the mental physical, the physical consciousness now turning and becoming expressive of the mind's capacities. So now when you look at it this way, just these three planes, these three grades of substance, their intermingling creates a rich variation of further sub-layers, each of which now acquires its own particular characteristic, which is a combination of the other two or three in different degrees. So you will find in the vocabulary of Sri Aurobindo, the three in each of the three. So you have the physical, vital, physical, mental, physical, vital, mental, vital, physical, mind, vital, mind, mental, mind. And you wonder, why are you bothering with all this? Because in reality there's a continuity of gradations, but they are so distinctive in their continuity that we have to give them distinct names if we are to describe their operation in us, and especially if we are to work upon them to teach them a new way of being in their own nature, to teach the mind to think differently. Well, you need to be able to isolate the mind and the thought process. In its operations, there are faculties of the memory, for example, faculties of logic, faculties of perception. Well, each of these has to be identified, distinguished if you are to change them or even transmute or transform them. And so we begin to have these finer distinctions when we face, for example, very often, this is the most common term you will find, you're stuck in the physical mind. Therefore, for you, the things of the higher world seem unreal. You'll find Sri Aurobindo writing in his letters. It's the physical mind which feels that it's impossible. Someone says, there is the soul, the divine presence. You are being sent mother's help. Oh yeah, I don't feel it, I don't see it. Is it really possible? You're asking me to believe in something, but I have doubts coming all the time. And so Sri Aurobindo will write something like, it's the physical mind which is doubting because it does not know these things. But the idea being, in your mind there are these higher layers which don't need to have that dullness of the physical mind. They don't share in its doubt. In those higher parts, especially in the highest aspiring layers of the mind, yes, it's true, it's obvious. There's no doubt there. Where do I live? If I fall back in the physical mind, the doubt returns. And so Sri Aurobindo will write to some of the sadhaks who have these repeated doubts, bouts of doubts. He will write, even if I write 100 letters, you will not be convinced. Because the problem is not in the logic of what I am saying or in the experience, it is in the dullness of the physical mind and its refusal to accept. So you can give all the evidence, it will still say, but what if? And there's nothing to be done there. So what is to be done here? You have to rise above the physical mind or awaken in the physical mind now this higher layer of consciousness where I know, where I feel the truth as a living truth and infuse that experience. And so these distinctions of the layers become relevant when we begin to introspect and begin to consciously work upon our evolution. But we haven't spoken of 3 layers. There are further 2. The mind itself now is very rich and wide. Just as the physical body consciousness, we can distinguish gradations of body substance. The bone, for example, is the densest, hardest, least conscious. The muscular tissue is more soft, more conscious. Nervous tissue is most conscious, most fragile also. If you do not eat properly or sleep properly for a few days, the first thing to get destabilized, not the bone, not the muscle, nerves. They are the most fragile. And when the nerves get destabilized, my hand starts shaking, for example, because the nerves are leading the muscular operation. I mean, but there's a grade of substance in the body which is very close to the mind. When the nerves are agitated, my thoughts are confused and clouded. So you see, in the physical substance, in the physical body itself, fine gradations, each mapping to and connecting to or under influence of these higher levels above. Is it possible that in the gross physical body itself there is a layer that is responsive not only to thought but to things of the higher ranges of the mind, even to the spirit? And yes, there is. And because it exists, therefore, even in the body one can experience the touch of the spirit if it has been sufficiently awakened and refined in its sensitivity in that particular fine layer. And if such a fine layer exists, obviously it is not something which you can touch as you can push on the bone. It does not have that gross density, and yet it belongs to the physical body and the physical substance. So it is on this idea of fine gradations going beyond the densest, grossest physical into finer, refined layers that we have this principle of the concept of brahmacharya, the idea of containing the generative energies of the body, that they grow in finer, refined gradations in which one is able to receive and enter the influence of still higher ranges of consciousness. And so all of this is part of the current organization of the body. In the Ayurveda they speak of 7 layers, 7 gradations in the body tissue substance itself. And this is part of the physical material world in a tiny grade layer. Sri Aurobindo refers to some of the ancient traditions speaking of 7 grades of material substance, of which the grossest is this material world that we are conscious of. Within that are these 7 gradations in our body, biology. There is a subtle physical, not one but finer gradations of those. And all of that is knowledge of the physical world only. In the vital world, similarly, so many fine gradations. In the mental world, so many. And obviously, if the consciousness is more free and plastic as in the mental world, the finer distinctions would be many more and much more distinct in their variations. So in the mental world itself, we have a huge, numbers don't matter. Remember, there's a continuity. We could always say infinite. For convenience, we say 7 within each. And within those 7, this is a way of counting only. But in the mental world, so many gradations. So to look at it in this perspective, the human evolution has touched only the first layers consciousness, the organization of the rational mind, which is for us such a great thing. And above that, you're familiar with the layers that Sri Aurobindo refers to as the higher mind, illumined mind, intuitive, overmental, and so on. But still, this is a domain of mind, M capital. And above that is the supramental. Above that is the Satchidananda, of which equivalent layers of consciousness can be organized in us. Yogic knowledge speaks of these two layers also as having bodies in us, identified with the lower three. But these upper two bodies are completely undeveloped. They are there at best as a rarefied support, like an ambience supporting, containing, and holding together the individual. But there's nothing of its development. Think of it this way. If our physical biology had not developed the distinction between bone, muscle, nerve, and other tissues, we would not be able to get up, walk, speak. Very simple. If you don't have stiff bone, you cannot support a structure. You'd be like jellyfish, a mass sitting simply, able only to move in water. If you didn't have musculature, you would have no movement. If you had no nerves, you would have no perception. No vehicle for embodied mind to be able to communicate and experience through the body. So in the same way, in the mind, if the faculties of the mind are not developed, we say somebody is mentally challenged, stupid, whatever term we use, all it means is the mental substance is there, but its finer operations and the faculties of its operations have not been developed and harmonized and enriched. And the same applies for the things of the upper two bodies. There is this fine substance of consciousness supporting, holding, containing and upholding. But since the finer gradations of its working are not developed, we are spiritually stupid. In other words, living in a stupor, we are in a blindness of the spiritual layers. As those develop, we will say we are evolving, awakening into a spiritual consciousness, until we would actually in that awareness say, I am consciously a spiritual being, eternal, immortal, infinite in my consciousness, and inhabiting this mind-life body. In the same way as my mind says, I am mental being inhabiting this biology. But those are not developed, and that's really what evolution is about in the individual level. So we've taken just one example of the individual and explored how so many levels exist within us. Developed, less developed, and undeveloped. But now consider the whole cosmos, the body of the divine. How many layers? So you have the 7 major planes. Within each of them, all are represented. So you say finer gradations of each, 7 into 7. Within each of those, again, all are represented. So you could make finer differences if you wanted to, but at some point it becomes a bit unnecessary. We realize the full richness of the cosmos. Just as in our body, all these layers are interacting. In our personality, all these layers are interacting. So in the cosmos, all these layers are interacting. This gives you a sense of the richness of the cosmic play. You cannot know any one event in the cosmos fully unless you see all the levels which are influencing it. And then in its own level, all the things which are influencing it. So for example, when you have a great event in history, the French Revolution, you see social and political circumstances, things building up until it was obvious there had to be an explosion. But what's the form of the explosion? What is the direction of the explosion? Well, if you're very careful, you will see it is towards some kind of freedom when people are oppressed, and so on. And that would be seeing the domain of the mind, emotions, and physical of the people on a social and political layer. But if you could see above and beyond these, you would see spiritual forces working, provoking in the people those thoughts of liberty, of equality, Fraternity not so much, because the vehicle was not ready to awaken to that in a deeper sense. But still the ideas were being infused. You will see, going back 20, 30, 40, 50 years, these ideas caught first by the dreamers of society. The playwrights, the storytellers, the poets, philosophers, and they conceive of some kind of an ideal society. And where does this idea come? Beings, powers from the higher planes infusing these upon humanity, and these people being the most ready so far, catching them, translating, dulling them into themselves, and then again new pressures coming to refine those ideas, to build upon them something greater, more complete. And then forces to push them, forces intervening to create a space in which these ideas could be protected. Now, we have no idea what that means. You see Joan of Arc coming in as a special emanation of the divine for this purpose. If not for her intervention, it was miraculous. All her life was a series of miracles. If not for that intervention, a safe space would not be created in which these ideas could sprout and lead to a revolution, a new form, a new rhythm of human social being, from where it could be rippled out into the whole world. I see the far sight of the powers acting on this. The necessity of intervention, sometimes of such a dramatic character, magical, miraculous, because there was no other way left. Without that intervention, the whole thing would have been lost into a sea of darkness again. And all of this is being prepared across centuries. The mother makes this observation that for the preparation of her body, nature took 2000 years. Think about what that means. Let's say about 2000 years ago. Something from high above initiates the movement to prepare for this birth. Nature now is impelled, and in her layers across all these planes, things begin to move. They work through human agencies, using human substance, human thought, human emotion to gather the material. Consider what that would mean. You see, because everything is seamless, everything is in a continuity. All the barriers we put with our mind, if you see everything in continuity, you will see how civilizations rise and fall in continuities and mingle and join and break away and reform. And energies, sometimes fine lines, threads of energies working through them, creating, forming specialized psycho-spiritual, cultural lineages, psychological variations, genetic imprints, weaving them across civilizations and then bringing them together for one or two very simple formations. And that's heredity, that's history. I think 4 or 5 different distinct psychological types and nationalities involved. A very rich mix. But consider this also. To that vision from above, to create only one such point would be risky. Because equally as there are divine beings working for this, there are also contrary forces whose job it is to spoil the game, to break the work being done, and so on. And there's a whole game of, if I may use this phrase, game of chess. Steps anticipating each other's moves, preventing and strategizing. To create one body would not be enough. A series of different focal points would have to be created. A space would have to be created where the civilization, the best of the European development, would be brought in together. And Mother refers to this, that she took birth in France because it was at that point the most evolved, the most rich, culturally the peak of Europe. But if you see the physical layout of Europe and the cultures of each of the countries, each had developed a kind of a specialization around, and then all of these mixed into France. We used to have a teacher here a French teacher by the name of Archaka. And he once said this to us. He was also playwright and a dramatist, a very interesting man. And he compared France with other countries. And he said, if you go into above France, into England, you will see the nature of the humor, stiff upper lip. If you go below France into Italy, you have ha 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 ha. And it's as if in France the full extremes of this humor mix in together and you have a rich play. And this is just one example he gave. I remember must have been 12 or 13 when he gave this. But it stuck because you could see how true this was. But you see so many more things when you go into detail. So a whole focal point is created. Always you will see in the scheme of nature. She builds specialities and then brings them together and creates one space where there's this enormous enrichment. And then from there it bursts out into the world. And then all of these things, including the French Revolution and all these preparations, if you see in the context of this one birth, it may even seem as if all this was necessary for this birth. Or if you see it another way, you will see nature had to do all these things anyway for human evolution, and this one birth found this point which was the focal point of nature's efforts. Which is true? They are both true simultaneously. In the mind which is freed, you do not see anymore this distinction. It is one movement that has multiple facets. I'm giving all this in detail because here we get a glimpse of how complex the play of the universal manifestation is, spanning all these layers, all these levels, from above working down, from below calling and aspiring, and alignments, connections, influences, long-term visions. And that's why you will see in the last 2,000 years, so many, in every culture, in every religion, people foreseeing the coming future as a dramatic shift, a dramatic change, end of an age, beginning of another, but they are not able to see beyond that curtain of transition. The transition itself they see through symbols, fire, brimstone, water, whatever symbols they use. They saw this because already the movement had been initiated around that time, of which we are now seeing the results. And to cosmic forces presiding even higher, they see rhythms spanning millions of years. What is one civilization? It's just a blip in eternity. You see planets rising and collapsing. You see entire galaxies crashing into each other or newly emerging. And on that scale, what would you say? And all of this is happening simultaneously across all these planes of the cosmos. And so, when he says, the divine possesses and finds himself on many planes, this is the big picture of what that means. And on each plane, he is entirely present, possessing himself, becoming and forming that layer of consciousness that is that plane. Being himself now finds himself in all the innumerable forms and their interactions on that plane and across from that plane to other planes, above and below. In each of them he finds himself and all the relationships created. What a rich, complex picture. So simply, pithily stated. And then, and through many poles of his being. So, possesses and finds himself on many planes and through many poles of his being. That is, possesses and finds himself through many poles of his being. So what are the poles of his being? The two most obvious, the most extreme, are his pole of the highest, transcending all forms, pure spirit, formless, essential. And then on the other extreme of the pole, matter, inconscient, divided into infinitesimal points, an infinity of infinitesimal points, almost losing itself into darkness, emptiness, non-existence. And these two are the extremes, the two poles that Sri Aurobindo refers to again and again, which have to be bridged because the divine himself is both extremes and everything in between. So in ourselves, we are meant to bridge them. But these are not the only ones. There are other poles. There's this individual pole, and then there's the pole of the multiplicity. We are many, and the whole society of so many individual conscious beings and forms, each of which is the self, representing itself. And then the collectives, you could even look at those as poles. But these are the two main poles. There's one more, whether you would call it a pole or not. The energy linking these, the space in between these individual forms, the many, Sri Aurobindo uses three words. This energy, power or nature through which the relations of the one and the many are maintained. That also you could see as a thing in itself, as an extreme pole. And then there is the one more pole, which is the transcendence above, beyond all this manifestation. And through many poles, each of these is like an extreme against which the others are completely as if irrelevant or subservient to that pole, which is itself seems to be the whole of the divine. So let's reread this half of the sentence. The divine has many essential modes of his eternal self-manifestation, possesses and finds himself on many planes and through many poles of his being. And the second half of the sentence, to each mode, its purpose. To each plane or pole, its fulfillment, both in the apex and the supreme scope of the eternal unity. Now when we look at this big picture like this, each mode has its own particular purpose, without which the universe would not be complete, would not be itself. Each plane and each pole has its fulfillment. What it is able to bring into its layer, in its being, so distinct, so unique, that the universe would be incomplete without this. Fully developed. It's as if on each of these planes you can have an unending evolution of possibilities, unending richness of expression. And that has to be entirely fulfilled. And the next has its own particular one entirely to be fulfilled. And so the second half of the sentence is discussing the value and the importance of each of these in the whole cosmos. And the degree of this fulfillment, he says, both in the apex and the supreme scope of the eternal unity. Now the fulfillment itself is given two dimensions. In the apex, that is, in itself it has to be entirely fulfilled, and then it's still greater fulfillment in the unity of the whole. So in the physical world, the physical possibilities of matter have to be entirely fulfilled. But after that, there is the fulfillment of the role of the physical world in the totality of the cosmos and its relation with all the other planes and all the other modes and all the other possibilities. That will be also its fulfillment. So each of these poles or planes in itself must find in its uniqueness, in its distinctiveness and isolation, its full satisfaction, and then it finds its complete satisfaction in its relation with the total unity. It is here that we get a glimpse in history why there have been these exaggerated philosophies or religions or spiritual lineages and experiences. Sri Aurobindo puts it in a different way in his Foundations of Indian Culture, where he says in India there was a civilization that was developed which fearlessly explored all the extremes of the spiritual experience, each to be taken to its exaggerated extreme of potential. So if there was the possibility to withdraw from the world and lose oneself into self-extinction, nirvana, cutting off completely from manifestation, well, that had to be explored. And if that is explored, it necessarily has an enormous power and imprint on the whole civilization because of the nature of the experience. If there was to be a complete indulgence and immersion in the physical senses and their play of possibilities and the richness possible in a sensory experience of life, that also had to be explored to its maximum potential, even to the point where it begins to break down. Explore that extreme also. And in the spiritual domain, each possibility of realization, a self-realization in isolation, a self-realization in expression in life, a realization only of the heart's opening, a realization only of the mind's awakening, a realization only in the spirit of service and action. Each of these becomes a specialized lineage, tradition, school of teaching, philosophy. And each looks at the whole universe from its extreme pole and position, as if this alone is important. Not that they have a purpose in isolation only. They have that satisfaction. Once that is done, suddenly the movement begins to lose its special power. During the time when it lives, it is as if the single most influential philosophy or school or teaching. And then suddenly it fades out and something else emerges. And so as not to lose that extreme poise, nature still continues to keep a few individuals who are drawn to that, who maintain that extreme edge. And then another extreme edge is formed, and another extreme, and another. And nature builds these extreme positions to create as if the largest possible space into which now all of these pour. And Mother explains how she builds these exaggerated extremes and then suddenly brings them all together to create the richest possibilities. The time of her choice to create these richest possibilities is now. So you see two things happening. These extreme positions are there. They no more have their special power, but they are all brought in together in collision against each other. Where earlier people were happy to live in their own specialized development of culture, national identities, psychological types, teachings, religions, philosophies. They were happy. Oh yeah, we criticize those, they are inferior to us. Now suddenly we are brought in collision in a way that I am not allowed to criticize another. I am forced to acknowledge the validity and the importance of the other and the uniqueness of the other and still maintain mine. You see the way the world has worked. There's no way you can explain it. A person who takes that kind of extreme position just withers and fades out. If you want to survive, you have to accept the validity of the other, even if you are critical of some of its limitations. And so you see suddenly all over the world the coming together of religions, philosophies, cultures, nationalities. Even what nature is doing is bringing together people from disparate extremes and bringing them together in work, in relationships, in demand of the evolution itself. And we have no explanation for that. It just happened in the last 50 years perhaps. The Mother said that's when nature had decided now to bring in all these things together. And that's why she highlighted the need for not just religious teaching, but what she called, there's a term she used for studying each other's religions. I forget the term exactly. The idea is one begins to appreciate the other traditions and understand one's own in relation to other. I think the word nowadays being used is inter-religious or inter-spiritual, but she used a very specific term which slips my mind now. And when she said that, nobody was interested in such things. In spite of people's lack of interest today, it's happening by compulsion. I was invited to a meeting in Bahrain a year or two ago, And it was the government of Bahrain which had brought together people from all cultures, all religions. Although initially all their meetings were primarily Abrahamic, they soon realized that it was not complete unless they brought in people from some other traditions. So the Eastern traditions were also invited, and we had Buddhists and Taoists and others. We were all given separate secondary place, but we needed to be represented for them to be able to say, okay, we have it all. And then of course we were given the best possible exposure of their best of their culture, and then interviewed, how did you like your visit, what do you think of this meeting? And of course everyone gushes fully. It was a propaganda stunt in a way, but still the propaganda stunt would be incomplete unless it included everybody. And this is the change. It is as if compelled on us whether we like it or not, and it has happened in a subtle shift of the mindset. Nobody tried to do it consciously. Nobody even wanted it consciously. It has happened. And there's no other explanation for this except an action from above. To use the vocabulary of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, it is the supramental consciousness which has been working behind the scenes through the minds of people, through the hearts of people, unknown to them, to bring together humanity and weave this underlying unity, make the unity emerge. And it will continue in spite of us. But increasingly, as we become conscious, we can participate and speed up. So the idea here is this. There is a satisfaction in itself in the extreme of its fulfillment. And then there is this fulfillment in the unity, where now each of those extreme positions actually serves a purpose. It lives to enrich the full play in the unity. If not for that extreme position, the unity would be incomplete. Something would be missing. By keeping an extreme position now connected and sharing, giving its best to the whole, it has as if stretched each of those traditions to include this extreme. If you see the picture, it's like a drum that needs to be stretched on all the edges for it to be one smooth, resonant surface. If one edge is not sufficiently tightened, that's dull. The surface doesn't resonate. You have to tension each edge equally, then the full surface becomes resonant. You see in the analogy, you can feel this importance of each edge. And it's playing a role even now. Although we no more look at these specialized extremes of philosophies in this way as playing any significant role. Sri Aurobindo lists all of them. I'm not so good with these names, but in the Greek culture, he refers to the various schools which came up, including some of them who were even English words now which describe those boys, where they became Stoic, for example, the Stoic school. Okay, the Stoicism as a practice. If you think about it and talk about it today, people will say, oh, what were those crazy guys doing? But the poise of the Stoic is a relevant poise in the normal evolution of our consciousness. That somebody represented that and made an extreme of it in life was necessary for all of us today to be able to take a stoic poise when necessary to deal with certain situations and as a transitional poise before we come to a true equality of the self. So he lists many of these very specialized schools and their leaders. There was a time when, for example, Socrates would sit in the marketplace and provoke people to think, to play with ideas, to play with logic. If you do that today, you will get beaten up and called a crazy person. But at that time, it was something novel, it was necessary, but the principle of it now being established in humanity, you can see that in a classroom, we can have that kind of marketplace talk he did in marketplace, in every classroom, without exception, to whatever degree. So all of these, and Sri Aurobindo points to them as the pure cultural units. And then it says after that age, it is pre-2000 years ago, 2500 or more, in many places on earth. It was not the only one, but since that is better documented in the West, he takes those examples. Each of those he describes as the pure cultural units. After that, you do not find any more the pure cultural units. You find combinations of two or more of these extremes, which form the next layer of the culture. And then the mixing of those which forms the most enriched form of the Greek culture, in its arts, in its philosophies, and so on. But similar processes taking place all over the earth until finally the whole thing comes into one grand intermixture. But the distinctiveness is still present and relevant for the fullness of this. So, we reread now the second half of the sentence. To each mode its purpose, to each plane or pole its fulfillment, both in the apex and the supreme scope of the eternal unity. See how much is captured in this. So the first half of the sentence describes the facets in the manifestation. The second half justifies their place in the fulfillment. So now I read the full sentence and you will see, try to capture the full experience of what it shows you. The divine has many essential modes of his eternal self-manifestation, possesses and finds himself on many planes and through many poles of his being. To each mode, its purpose. To each plane or pole, its fulfillment in the apex and the supreme scope of the eternal unity. You can see in one sentence he has captured the full richness of the universe, its full diversity of possibilities, and justified it in all. And now the rest of the paragraph takes one step in the elaboration, and then subsequently other paragraphs go deeper into each of these. It is necessarily through the individual self that we must arrive at the One. For that is the basis of all our experience. By knowledge, we arrive at identity with the One. For there is, in spite of the dualist, an essential identity by which we can plunge into our source and free ourselves from all bondage to individuality and even from all bondage to universality. And it describes further how it's not only through knowledge but through immersion in the rapturous immersion in the divine love, and at the same time the action in nature preserves the soul form. And so all of this, the rest of the paragraph, which I don't want to read because it's a bit long, he shows you the importance of the individual. From the individual, the underlying oneness in which he realizes the many, identity with the many, the play of nature which protects the role of the individual to allow for this rich play, and through the individual, the divine consciousness pouring through in the action of its will, in the action of its love, knowledge. And at the end of the paragraph he says, we have experienced from within the ignorance the play of separation. Now from the poise of the underlying unity, we re-embrace the multiplicity. And at that point, he says, the whole basis of the play changes. Unity will be the law. Difference will be simply for the various enjoyment of that unity. Neither descending again into that plane of division which clings to the separation of the ego sense, nor attached to an exclusive seeking for pure identity, which cannot have to do with any play of difference. We shall embrace and reconcile the two poles of being where they meet in the infinity of the highest. So at that point there's the reconciliation of the extreme in the oneness undifferentiated, and here in the play of the many, and yet on the basis of the freedom of the oneness, and there we meet the highest in its infinity, the full spectrum, the full range, the full possibilities in the underlying unity. So that's the direction to which he leads us. The rest of the paragraph we will read on the Friday after next, as next Friday we will not be meeting here, and we will of course have the sessions of Sunday as usual for both weeks. So we'll pause here and we can take up any questions, any comments. In a sense, we have only covered one sentence today. But what a grand and rich sentence. In this picture, you can see, in this grand picture, you can see why everything is justified. However extreme in its edge or in its narrowness and limitation, even that as an extreme is justified. Every position, every perspective, every attempt, every effort, even that which is perverse or false, has in the larger scheme a place, and it serves something in the whole. And it is only when we come from this kind of a integral perspective that we can understand the full richness of the evolution and the complexity both of the human life and struggles, but also the evolution in the cosmos and its struggles. We'll continue then next time.
Mm-hmm.